one of the privileges of getting the graveyard slot is, of course, that some people have had to go home, and one of our speakers has to leave to go and save the sturgeon. So Charles has got to make a dash to save a very rare species. I just wanted to use this in the context of this extraordinary conference, which I've only been able to attend half of, to just look at, in hopefully an optimistic way forward, about how we are going to restore the abundance of our oceans post-Brexit. My name is Richard Benyon. I was briefly relevant as a fisheries and marine minister in the coalition government, and still take a great interest in these matters. And as was said by someone earlier, I was a Remain voter in that lovely referendum we all enjoyed. But I, like most people, it was never a binary issue, and I found enormous frustrations with the European Union, and I spent many hours negotiating the reform of the Common Fisheries Policy, and I sat in organisations like the IWC, which made FIFA look honest, and there we had to sit in the EU coordination meeting and water down Britain's conservation ambitions for whales and cetaceans, because we had to have a single EU position. It's one example of how I think there's an opportunity now where we can look to a time where Britain can reassert itself in fora such as that. We can get our own house in order in terms of how we manage our seas, and we can look to a future where we are managing stocks of fish that we are harvesting, of which we are harvesting the surplus, rather than digging into the bank of our fish stocks and depleting our oceans. I've got Willie Mackenzie here, who's an author and the Oceans campaigner for Greenpeace. I've got Lasse Gustafsson, the Senior Vice President and Executive Director of Oceana for Europe, and Charles Clover, who is the Executive Director of Blue Marine Foundation, journalist, writer, and all-round hero of our oceans. Can I start, Charles, with you, because I have a horrid feeling you're going to leg it. Do you just... people like to blame the Common Fisheries Policy as if it's the deliverer of all the evils of the world. What do you want to see that would emerge out of Brexit to be something that you feel we are taking a long-term ecosystems approach to the management of our seas?
Thank you, Richard. I would very much like to see us take this 1 in 100 year opportunity to write a new fisheries law for Britain. In my view, it should actually be a natural resources law, because it ought to take in the things that the Common Fisheries Policy was never able to resolve, one of which is nature conservation. It was never able to decide whether fishing or marine protection should take precedence. So that's one of the things it could do. Stocks are recovering all over Europe as a result of sensible reforms in Europe by quite a lot of effort by people like Richard. Things have been coming back, but no one should delude themselves that the Common Fisheries Policy is the best policy in the world. As we discovered in a conference that we had in the autumn about best practice in world fisheries, where we looked at America, Australia, New Zealand, and Norway, a lot of those countries have a lot to teach us, and we could actually do it better here, provided we can maintain a level of agreement with those with whom we manage shared stocks. Now, the Norwegians manage 90% of the value of their fisheries as shared stocks with somebody, either with us or with Russia, so it shouldn't be impossible. But it's maintaining that international agreement, the agreement of common standards, of common metrics, that is actually the number one thing you've got to do. And then There are lots of other things you can do, like have a Magnuson-Stevens Act, like the Americans do, which actually which doesn't monkey about with, let the minister monkey about with what quotas each sector should have, which is a recipe for disaster, but it seems to be what George Eustace wants. You have a law that requires him to make sure that everything is managed under MSY, and he merely appoints the institutions which do that. And you have some nature conservation. Rest my case.
Lasse, Oceana have been campaigning on ecosystems approach, applying natural capital and all the other new ideas that are going into marine conservation. If you had Michael Gove sitting in the front there and you had 1 minute to really condense what his thinking should be as we take forward a fisheries bill and the kind of legislation that would create the framework, what would you say?
So, full disclosure first, carry a Swedish passport and I live in Spain. So what I say about Britain, you can think about what you like, take it or leave it. This is an outsider's perspective. My only connection to the UK is in my bag here I have the key to our UK office, and we're hiring to start operations in the UK as soon as we have the right people in place. The most important thing when you think about fisheries in Europe and in Britain is stop being pessimistic. The future for fisheries is bright if we do the right things. And how do I know? Well, I asked our chief scientist 3 years ago, how much fish could we have in European waters if we managed for full potential? And he said, I don't know. And I said, Ricky, you're the chief scientist. That's the kind of stuff that you should know. Yeah, he said, but nobody knows. So I commissioned a study and was asking that question to 15 scientists around the world, and it says, how much fish could we have in European waters? And you don't need to read the study. I can tell you the most important part is, in less than 10 years, we can catch 60% more fish than we do today, sustainably, if we rebuild the stocks. In a month's time, I'm going to present the British case at the London School of Economics. I have the draft in my bag, don't steal it. The future is bright if you do the right things. And I'll spend a minute with the State Secretary on what do you need to do. You need to manage fisheries based on a scientific understanding of the stocks. Catch limits set based on science. You need to protect the most important fish habitats. So the North Sea is probably one of the most productive seas on the planet. Oh, sorry, we have very long minutes in Spain.
Yeah, it's okay. Mañana.
The North Sea is one of the most productive seas on the planet, but it's down 40% than it was 2 generations ago. Some of that is irreversible. It's cables, pollutions, other stuff. But you could bring back productivity by protecting the places where fish spawn and grow. And the third thing is you need to stop destructive fishing practices. You have bottom trawling, for instance, on some of the places where there should be no bottom touching gear. If you do these 3 things, there's a few other things you need to worry about, but catch limits based on science, protect essential fish habitats, and stop destructive fishing practices. Your industry and your waters will flourish.
Willie, as a fisheries minister or in fisheries debates in Parliament, you get very simplistic arguments made about fisheries management, and they're usually around things like there is one regime that will work, an effort-only days at sea regime or something similar, and that one type of fisherman is good and another type of fisherman is bad. It's more complex than that, isn't it? And what are Greenpeace's thinking at the moment about the kind of direction we should take in this historic opportunity to change a system of management that has failed us so much in recent years?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with almost everything that's already been said, and I think that one of the interesting things that you alluded to about the negotiations you've had with the common fisheries policy recently is that we don't have a chance to see whether that works, because I think there's a lot of stuff that came through from those negotiations about how we could do things better, setting scientific limits, rewarding people who were fishing sustainably, rewarding people who were providing jobs and support for local communities and all the rest of it. And I don't think we will know whether that would have actually taken, but those are the key principles I think that we really need to go forward with. And I think that one of the opportunities we have with Brexit is actually all the stuff that you were fighting for we've got nothing to hamper us now, right? We don't have to worry about the Spanish deep water fleet or distant water fisheries. We don't have to worry about what Denmark wants with their own fisheries. So we have no reason to really constrain ourselves in how we want to make that management work. And I think the other thing beyond that is that we also need to think bigger than just fisheries management. The UK is unique in the world in that we have the fifth largest marine estate, we have UK overseas territories, we have massive diplomatic power, and we have the ability to be a leader on conservation of the ocean much beyond fisheries.
And Charles, so one of the mistakes we think about an opportunity like this is all about fisheries. It's much more than that. It's about the marine environment. And do you want to say something about marine conservation, embedding that into some new policy? So we're hardwiring spatial protections and other protections as part of a new marine policy.
Well, we haven't been particularly brilliant at creating marine reserves in the UK. That's entirely under our own law, but we have, and therefore is not a Brexit issue, but the Brexit issue is out there in the oceans, where we have done some quite sensible things, creating big marine reserves around British overseas territories, and we continue to do so, and Willie and I are part of a campaign to do more of that. But when you look out there at these little pinpricks on the ocean surrounded by huge amounts of sea, you realize that they are entirely dependent upon the management regime of entire oceans. And we are involved in that. We're involved in that currently as the EU. We are part of a delegation, which includes the French distant water fleet, the tuna fleet particularly, and particularly the Spanish and Portuguese tuna fleets. And that has tended to dictate policy and what we said about the management of these regional fisheries management organizations, about how we responded to ideas about protection for Antarctica, and how we responded to all ideas about protecting marine reserves on the high seas. All of these things have been contaminated, in my view, by the commercial fisheries dominance in the argument in Europe. And if we remove that dominance and try and regard this as a public good, the ocean is a public good, rather the agriculturists are coming around to thinking that the land is, that this is something that the public has an influence over, then we would actually run our policy differently. We currently have a policy in DEFRA about tuna, which is dictated by two flagships, Spanish flagships, on the British register. They are Spanish owned, they catch tuna, and DEFRA only has a policy of reacting to the big ocean conservation questions in respect of catching capacity. Now that's a really good idea, isn't it? Of course it isn't. We should be doing this on behalf of the British public. We should be putting together whole delegations of positive, sensible, conservation-minded fisheries managers to go out to places which are frankly running out of fish, like the Indian Oceans, and make allies with South Africa and other nations who see this much more close water quarters and want to do something about it. I mean, we are the largest buyer of tinned tuna, as far as I know, other than America, and all of it comes out of the Indian Ocean, which is being catastrophically mismanaged by a regional fisheries management organization in which we are only represented by the EU. So we could do that better.
So that, leading on from that, I mean, our FMOs are failing in large
everywhere.
Parts of our oceans. And as Charles says, the UK subsumed its involvement in these organisations to the EU, and the interest in it has been low. With re-engagement in those organisations like the International Whaling Commission and others, what can we do to make sure marine conservation is not just lines on a map, that they are meaningful measures, and that we are managing fisheries and the and the exploitation of the seas better.
That's forgive me. I must see a man about a fish, but on your
Save the sturgeon, Charles. Thank you.
Sorry.
Good seeing you, Charles. So, the North Sea, I'll keep coming back to the North Sea. We're opening our office in the UK not because of Brexit, but because of the North Sea. It's an amazing place, not primarily for its biodiversity, but for its productivity. So, this is the last year, I believe, that we will have quota negotiations on the North Sea under the current regime. We're very excited to see what's coming next. How will the UK want to manage shad stocks? How will the EU possibly respond to closed waters in the UK in terms of putting up trade barriers? What is true, and we see that everywhere, even in the RFMOs, some of them are more functional than others, where you have management and they are not enforced because they cannot be enforced most of the time, but when they are limiting catches based on science, when they are protecting essential fish habitats, I'm repeating myself, fish comes back. So I think the most important thing for Britain, the one thing that I hear more today than anything else, UK should be a leader. That's in every discussion we hear UK as a leader. So if you take that approach and manage to lead on those very effective principles, science-based quotas, protection of essential fish habitats, maybe you can make the RFMOs work more effectively. Clearly the EU, with Britain, has mismanaged its waters for at least 30 years. We've had overfishing in European waters for at least the last 3 decades. UK is no exception. I mean, northwestern waters, 49% of the stocks are overfished. North Sea, 40% of the stocks are overfished. This is the opportunity for Britain to show some real leadership by bringing back fish, by applying these different methodologies that we know work.
But we have a problem here, don't we? If it was just all as simple as mackerel, which is just a single stock, and you can have a pretty accurate view as to what's in the sea, and vessels go out and catch that surplus, and you can manage it well. Most of our stocks around our waters are mixed stocks, so you've got different species swimming alongside each other, and you try and create a regime that excludes discards, that only targets the species that you want to be targeted, and manages that mixed stock without what's called choke species coming in the way. You know, how can we develop this? People are saying there's an easy way, which is just an effort-only regime, but there are others who are saying it's much more complicated. What do you think?
I think mixed fisheries are difficult. It's interesting to say mackerel is simple, because I remember just a few years ago when mackerel was a very complicated question, and it was a very geopolitical question.
I nearly caused a war.
Yeah, so it was going to be the second cod war, was going to be the mackerel war, but it's an interesting one, because actually one of the things I think going into the Brexit conversation is every conversation on fish at European level going to be like that? It was of mackerel, you know. And I think you've raised a couple of interesting points, and I think also to what Lasse said, the North Sea is really productive, but it was also probably the first place we all collectively overfished, right? Because of all the countries around it. Now, are we ever going to get the North Sea back to what it was before then? Probably not. It had oyster beds, a different water, it had grey whales and all the rest of it. Those don't exist anymore. But I think that when you come to looking at fisheries that are mixed, different sorts of methods of fishing, different kind of approaches to fishing, whether it's local, so you're tied to a local place, or whether it is mobile, then you do have to look at actually the broader management of the oceans. And so if we are going to look at something like an effort-based system, then you also have to put other bits of the ocean off limits. Now we know increasingly that what we hear is the need for protection at a level of say 30% of the oceans. We also know increasingly when it comes to climate change, we have evidence that everything from having more whales, more fish, and more krill in the sea is good for absorbing carbon. And so how do we manage those things across different sectors? And I think it was interesting talking about what you'd say if you had 1 minute to talk to the Secretary of State for the Environment. Because on oceans, of course, we're also talking about the FCO, we're talking about DFID, we're talking about international trade, we're talking about global security and the MOD. And so there's a whole bunch of ways that actually getting it right on the oceans at an international and a more regional level is really important for us all going forward.
I assume that chime is giving us the 5-minute 2 minutes.
Only 2.
Okay, so we already have to wrap up.
If you want to carry on a bit, I think that's gone a bit early.
Has that gone a bit early? Okay. No. Well, I'll come on just to talk about MSY. People talk about maximum sustainable yield as if it's a fairly straightforward, and we can all picture it in ourselves that there's a stock that is replenishing itself and there's a surplus which you can harvest. How can you create a system that incentivizes fishermen to be part of the effort to see a rising biomass? As an early days minister, until the scales fell from my eyes, I was very attracted by the fish share scheme in the catch share scheme in the United States, which seemed to me a market solution for an environmental problem where fishermen were directly incentivized to want to have an increasing biomass because they'd be able to harvest more fish. But ultimately, it's been a disaster in many areas because it has just fallen into the hands of 1 or 2 people, and the vast majority of fishermen have been excluded from that. Do you think that those sort of schemes are something that we can or should be looking at?
No, I think the one method that works is catch limits based on science, and in Europe, and we'll see what happens in the UK. In Europe, there is no market. This is totally regulated by politicians on the highest possible level. This is ministers responsible for fisheries deciding on the quotas for 150 stocks. This is a total regulated market. So if we want to have public control of this resource in the UK, you could then replicate that. If you want to have market mechanisms in this, and I agree, we've seen them fail in a couple of countries. I don't think there is a better management model than catch limits. What you would like to look at is who gets the quota allocation, and that's already happening on the national level. So in Brussels they decide on the total allowable catch, and then the quota allocation. It's quite interesting to see who gets the quota. And let me quote, I met the Danish Minister for Fisheries just before Christmas, where they had, of course Denmark doesn't have corruption, but if they did, in fishing, that would be a perfect example where the 10 friends of the minister get 60% of the catch quota. In the common fisheries policy, there is a clause about giving access to sustainable technologies, access to sustainable fishermen. You could have that kind of legal incentives by giving access to local communities, giving access to small scale, giving access to certain technologies. And it's very clear that in terms of job creation, in terms of profitability, small scale, generally speaking, is better than the big industrial. Not all small scale are great, and not all big industrial fishing are bad. But if you want to have a socio-economic dimension to your fishery, it's not only food production and tax base, then you should look at giving more access to local fishermen close to coast than what we're doing in the European Union at the moment, where the very large amount of catch quotas are given to big industrial fishing. And I think the 3 biggest one in the UK are all Spanish owned, which is interesting.
One of the interesting points made in there was that we should be, or was made to me earlier, was that we should be talking about people. When we're talking about agriculture or the oceans, that unless we're carrying people with us, it just feels a very remote, top-down sort of politicians saying something will happen, and then at the end of the day, people feel excluded from the decision-making. One of the most depressing things for me as Marine Minister is going around seeing how depleted and miserable some of our coastal communities were, and where the fishing industry, which is so intrinsic to its sense of worth, its sense of place, had all but disappeared and has disappeared in some areas. Now, Greenpeace have very much linked a conservation campaign with small fishermen.
Yeah.
And it's quite a simple argument, but it's not quite that simple, is it? Because there are some small fishermen who can overfish, and there are some very large fishing vessels who are fishing entirely sustainably.
Absolutely.
How do you logic? What is your logic behind this?
And I have the great privilege at the moment to live back where I used to live when I was a kid, which is an area which has lots of those little old fishing ports which people go to visit, and they're full of little boats, and it's all very cute and it's all very lovely. And it's an interesting one because I think when we talk about coastal communities, people have an image in their head, and you quite often see this when you see advertisements on TV for fish. The image that they use of the fishing boat is nothing to do with how that fish is caught. It's just a nice, cute image of a fishing boat, because people have in their head what it looks like. And if you start talking to the smaller fishermen who are much more tied to a place, they can't go very far, and that's true whether they're in Senegal or whether they're in Cornwall. Then they are limited in the same way as if you were only growing all your food in an allotment. So they can't go so far. So they have their own very particular worldview in that. And you're right. There's also other sorts of fisheries that are relatively clean, that are big fisheries. But when it comes down to kind of bang for buck in a local community, cafes, hotels, fish and chip shops, pulling tourists in, the little guys are what does it. And that's the thing that has really declined in past years as we've gone bigger and bigger. And I think it's an interesting, if you just look at a map of Europe and look at the UK and look at all the coastline that we have and think, wait a minute, if anyone in Europe should be self-sufficient on fish, it should be the UK. So we have a long way to go, but there's definitely a great opportunity to get back to kind of, more locally sourced fish, more British provenance on fish. We have to rebuild those stocks and absolutely do it at the right level. We also have to give advantage to the people who are bringing in most of those local communities. But I think there's a real opportunity for us to be really celebrating the stuff that we're catching around our own shores and be sufficient. And if you look at a map, there's a thing that I can't remember what date it is, but there's a thing every year where there's a date in the calendar when the EU is no longer sufficient for its own fish, and each country has a different date that they kind of run out of fish, from what they catch and what they eat a year. And obviously the UK is blessed because we have so much ocean. So I think if we can't get it right, we've got a problem.
So perhaps just to throw this open, I mean, people in the audience, I just want to have 30 seconds just on technology, because it would be a great mistake, wouldn't it, if we were to create a fisheries management, ocean management system that is dealing with the world as it is today, because Moore's law is being torn up. We've got the Internet of Things, which in fisheries terms could mean a camera in every net. Every single fish could be counted in real time and stored on some massive database in Newcastle. And we now have the ability to spatially manage around the Pitcairn Islands from just south of Oxford in the Catapult Centre. It is the most remarkable piece of technology. Are we thinking enough ahead to make sure that we are using the technologies of tomorrow? So I've slightly held this up on the stage because I'm sure there are people in the audience who'd like to.
So Oceana created Global Fishing Watch together with Google a couple of years ago, which is now tracking 60,000 fishing vessels. It's available. It's not Catapult because this is transparent. And if you go to your next computer, you type in globalfishingwatch.org, you will be able to track 60,000 vessels who's fishing internationally. You want to slice the pie and say, I want to have everybody's fishing with the British flag, I want to have everybody's fishing with the bottom trawl, or I want to have anybody fishing in this particular space. You can do that. It's available for everybody. Catapult is different because it's much more, some of the information there is not in the public sphere, and therefore probably, I haven't seen it, but what I understand, it's much more deeper in knowledge. Global Fishing Watch is available for everybody. We are now looking into, together with the Japanese Foundation, we're looking into, can we look into the future and see where illegal fishing will happen based on patterns, based on big data. So we're trying to be ahead of the curve on technology. It's quite interesting to see how fisheries is managed in the European Union. That's why I hope Britain will take a big step forward, where you have very little data, even though the data is available. So the European Union is managing all its fisheries in all its 21 coastal countries based on a 2-year-old data on 70 stocks. And we're fishing on around 400. So it's very data poor, even though the data is available somewhere. And I think this is where processing capacity, computer processing capacity, and big data comes in. And the EU is certainly not ready, and I hope Britain will take the opportunity.
Just realised we're going to have to wrap this up soon because it's my son's school play shortly. So, do you want to just come in?
We heard earlier from Matt Ridley about the concept of land sharing versus land sparing on terrestrial situations. i.e. farming slightly messily but with space for nature, or highly intensive sort of industrial type farming and then leaving conservation areas. How does aquaculture, what's the role of aquaculture and intensive aquaculture in this debate?
Yeah, good one. I mean, aquaculture is I think sometimes seen as no cost to the oceans, and I think that's where the problem lies. Is that it depends what aquaculture you're talking about, and generally speaking, particularly in this country, the fish that we like to eat are predatory fish. So it's the salmon, it's the tuna, it's the mackerel. So if you equate that to a land-based system, you're talking about wolves and tigers and bears, right? You're not talking about cows and pigs. And so there are a few jumps up the food chain, and that means you have to feed them something. And to feed them something as natural as possibly can, that tends to end up being fish meal. So if you have a situation where you're taking more fish out of the ocean to turn into fish meal to make salmon, it's not a good situation for the ocean. And then the other issue is in terms of any impact that you're having on the ocean. From our perspective, if you are going to go look at aquaculture, you need to look into the food in to food out ratio, and if you don't go down the route of fish meal, then what are the impacts of soya meal or whatever else you're using, and also what are the impacts of pollution locally. And I think a closed system on land would be the safest one to prevent any escapes and localized pollution.
I think if you look at the protein demand of exponential growth in population, take China. The graph of food demand is that, the graph of protein demand is like that. And so the potential for aquaculture is massive. The problem is, if in order to produce a kilo of whatever it is, you're having to get 1.2 kilos of anchovies off the coast
Which
of
might be
Peru.
better if we go for vegetarian fish.
Yeah.
So if everyone gets a taste for carp, we might be okay.
Or maggots.
That's the other point. If we can increase stocks by 60%, then surely that's the way that we should be driving thinking and advances, rather than this highly inefficient way in which we undeniably agriculture still versus a sustainably natural food is intrinsically inefficient.
And there's also how we make sense of the current waste in the system. So Richard was talking earlier about discards, and obviously, fish that gets caught and doesn't get landed, or fish that's too small, or whatever else, or bits of fish don't get used. How can you make a system work like that when it comes to aquaculture? And I think there's still a struggle there to make those two things fit together.
So currently 450 million people per day get their main source of protein from the ocean. With rebuilt ocean abundance, possibly we can feed 1 billion people a day a healthy meal of fish and seafood. Aquaculture will come on top of that, and some aquaculture will play an important role. I think carnivore fish, migrating fish, is a no-go because it's food waste, and if you find a way to feed Norwegian salmon vegetarian, you will lose on the omega-3 with a factor 30. So you will have fish with no nutritious values. Anything that grows on rope, mussels, oysters, eat as much as you can afford. Most of that is sustainable, and it definitely can be sustainable. And in the middle there we have the herbivore, the Chinese carp, which can be, but not always is, done in a sustainable way. So I think aquaculture will play a role. It's not the Norwegian salmon.
I mean, there's another part of that is eating further down the food chain. So eating the sardines and anchovies directly rather than turning them into fish meal makes just so much more sense.
And next time you
better for
order sea bass in a restaurant and you get a piece about the size of my hand and it's wild sea bass, you are eating an unsustainably caught fish because it hasn't grown big enough to breed. So all these poncy London chefs should be just producing bass from aquaculture systems, not, if that's what they want to serve, then from the sea. Let's just try and sort of wrap this up in a coherent way. What we have is an opportunity now to tackle problems that were deemed to be too massive to change. We like to look on the common fisheries policy as the example of utter and complete failure. Fewer fish, depleted marine economy, miserable fishermen that are left, and a degraded environment. But if you look at Callum Roberts' graph of the decline of cod in the North Sea, it hardly blips in 1972. It peaks in the war years, and otherwise it's just a steady decline because our ability to catch fish increases exponentially every year. So, in a way of summing up, can you both deliver the sort of key headline points that address the realities? Yes, we have a bad management system and we can all blame it. No one blames it more than I have. But it's much more complex than that. What are the key bullet points that we need to hold in our minds as we develop something that is as much importance to my constituents who live as far from the sea as they possibly can as it is from people who live right beside it? It's something deep in our psyche, probably in Sweden and in Spain as well. But Lasse, finish off with what you think our key bullet points of consideration should be.
So 1, there's no need to be pessimistic. 2, we know what works, and I'm saying this for the 3rd time, I'm sorry, but you open up. Science-based quotas, protect essential fish habitats. The one big question that I have is, how will you approach shared stocks, co-management of shared resources? Denmark, Norway, EU would want to have an opinion. They do have an opinion, and it's not necessarily the same as yours. But that's the big question. But science-based quotas, science-based catch limits, whatever you want to call it, we know it works. And actually, the common fisheries policy reform is bringing back fish slowly. But after the reform 2014, we see, so we have this graph. Sorry, it's not scientific, but so we're on our way back. And what works is the science-based catch limits primarily.
Yeah. Although there is only one way from the bottom, you can only go up.
Well, you can go.
But I think
you can flounder.
I think it's. I agree with all of that. I think it's also worth remembering that in the UK we have a great opportunity because of our geography, because of our history, because of our diplomacy, because of our overseas territories, to have a much bigger footprint. And a much bigger leadership role than many other countries. And it was interesting earlier talking about small fishermen. And if you ask a person on the street, are they favourable towards a picture of Captain Birdseye or a small-scale fisherman, then it's generally yes. If you ask them the same question about penguins, it's generally yes, right? So we have both of these things that we can protect. And I think this is the opportunity that we have going forward, is that all of the stuff that you fought for in those negotiations, which I'm sure went into the middle of the night, about what the UK wants from a reformed CFP system, let's absolutely implement that. Let's absolutely try to get the restoration in our local waters, but let's also think about what the impact is that we can have in actually kind of protecting, conserving and leading around the world too.
Well, I told David Davis the other day that he hadn't even touched what I went through, which was my worst was a 3-shirter, as it was called, which is 2 whole nights and 3 days of negotiations. And thank goodness I won't be doing that again. The point is that, to wind it up, there is opportunity for optimism. However, we mustn't forget that the vast majority of fish in the UK waters will either spawn, shoal and swim for one point in their annual life cycle in more than one nation's waters. And therefore, the idea that some of my colleagues have that at a line 200 miles out, everything within that line is under our control is, of course, not true. And we will have to negotiate, we'll have to engage, and we will have to work on a basis of scientific evidence as never before. But thank you, and in his absence, thank Charles as well for a really fascinating discussion at the end of it. I know for a lot of you it's been a long day, and now I've got to go and see a school play. Thank you very much.